Buckley. I'm an Associate Professor in German and Translation Studies at the University of Leeds. At the moment, we're in a field in the north of the town of Skipton in North Yorkshire, which is about 25 miles northwest of Leeds. Where we're standing now is the location of a First World War military training camp. It was built in early 1915 for the Bradford POWs. Bradford POWs regiments trained here and then went off to the Western Front to fight. Various other British regiments trained here, and then the site lay empty. Towards the end of 1917, Britain started capturing increasing numbers of German prisoners. Accommodation was needed for them, and it was decided to use the empty military training camps throughout the UK to accommodate these German prisoners. This camp in Skipton was one of 18 officers' camps. There were over 600 camps in total, but only 18 officers' camps in the country, and this was one of them. According to the Hague Convention of 1907, officer prisoners couldn't be put to work, so they had to find activities to occupy them on a day-to-day basis and also to create a purpose to their existence. Life wasn't too bad in the camp here. They were accommodated in wooden huts. The junior officers were 24 to a hut, and the senior officers accommodated in smaller groups. We didn't only have officers in the camp here. There were also a number of other ranks who were here as orderlies to the officers. So the maximum occupancy of the camp was about 560 officers with 120 to 130 orderlies. Reading contemporary newspaper accounts from the time of the camp, the local population weren't very enamoured with the idea of having German prisoners on the edge of their town. And at one point, the Germans were allowed out for a walk, and they went into town, and one of the locals threw an iron bar at the group of Germans as they walked through the town of Skipton. So after that, the Germans decided to do their walks north of the camp into the countryside rather than going through town. The Germans appreciated the countryside here in Skipton, and they enjoyed their walks from the camp, accompanied by a British guard. They found Skipton very wet, and they blamed the weather for their lack of success in gardening and their failure to grow certain vegetables. It was a huge problem, especially in winter, to keep things dry and stop their clothing and everything in the barracks from getting damp. And it was also a struggle to keep warm because they were only allowed to light the stoves in the centre of each barrack hut from 2 p.m. in the afternoon. So in the mornings, it was very cold. The German prisoners organised a wide range of activities in the camp. The day after they arrived, they organised a choir, and then they went on to add an orchestra, a chamber music group. They had a theatre group and put on a number of plays. They had a large library of books in the camp. These have been obtained from various charities, including the Swedish Red Cross. They actually had 1,284 books. They also organised an extensive education system in the camp. Sport was a really popular activity for the German officers and the other ranks in the camp. 70% of the Germans imprisoned here in Skipton took part in sport. One of the more popular sports was football. They played basketball. They also organised athletics, tennis, and gymnastics. So on the place where we're standing now, they'd measured out a 400-metre track, and they also had a sand pit where they did long jump, high jump, and triple jump. They managed to obtain a shot put and 2 discuses. And when they organised their sports festivals, they designed certificates that could be given out to the winners. And also they made prizes that were awarded to the winners of the various events. In 2014, a colleague of mine from the French department at the University of Leeds was doing some work in Skipton Library. And the library staff asked her if she could help with a book that they had in a shoebox in the storeroom. Nobody knows how long the book had been there or who brought it to Skipton. It was clearly written by the German prisoners from the First World War. And in the box alongside the book were various yellowing newspaper cuttings about the camp and some handwritten attempts to translate the book into English. Our colleague brought the book to the attention of the staff in the German department. Once we had a look at it, it was clear that it was probably the most detailed account of life in a British First World War POW camp in existence. So we set about a project to translate this book into English so we could bring the story of the camp and its prisoners to a wider audience. The book written by the German prisoners contains the work of between 50 and 60 different men. It contains accounts of life in the camp, poems, diary entries, and drawings. One of the most interesting aspects for me is their knowledge of the history of Skipton and the surrounding area. They'd clearly done a considerable amount of research into the history of this area, and I've actually learned some things about my hometown from the Germans. In the process of translating the book written by the Germans, we became curious as to who exactly these men were. So we started doing research using the Red Cross records and Ancestry to find out a bit more about the individual prisoners. Then I would write articles for the local newspaper, the Craven Herald, and put blog posts up on the university website. Out of the blue, in early 2017, I had an email from Ernesto Brucker, the son of one of the prisoners. Ernesto was living in Buenos Aires, and this is where his father, Georg Brucker, had moved to after being repatriated. Georg was one of the prisoners here. He was a lieutenant of the reserve in the Bavarian army. Georg Brucker was captured in April 1917 by the Canadians at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. He was initially taken to the Colsterdale camp, which is also in North Yorkshire, but then he was moved in January 1918 to the Skipton camp, and he was one of the first prisoners to arrive here when it opened that January. So we don't know exactly what Georg Brucker did activities-wise in the camp, but we do know that he was a keen athlete. And the reason we know this is that last year in February, Ernesto was clearing out some of the final pieces of his father's belongings, and he found a number of certificates that his father had won in the sports day here in July 1919 in the camp. So on the sports day, Georg Brucker won the high jump, he was second in the discus, he was second in the pentathlon, and he was third in the shot put. And the certificates that he got for these positions were made and designed by his fellow officers in the camp. So the winners of the events on the sports day were also given prizes, and these would have been made by their fellow officers in the camp. So for winning the high jump, Georg Brucker received a wallet. For his second place in the high jump, he got a cigarette holder. And for his third place in the shot put, he won a pipe. From the accounts written by the Germans in their book, we don't only learn about their day-to-day lives and the activities they organised here in the camp, we get a very detailed insight into their thoughts and feelings, how they missed home, and their thoughts on being captured and being imprisoned, and also their thoughts on how they were going to help to rebuild Germany once they were repatriated. The First World War ended on the 11th of November 1918, but that wasn't the end of the war for these prisoners. So it took almost a year before they were finally repatriated. Britain held on to the German prisoners until after the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919. And then after that, it took some time for things to get organised for the men to be finally repatriated to Germany. So this took place at the end of October 1919, the Skipton men. So the time after the armistice was a very difficult time for the prisoners because they had no idea how long they would continue to be held before they were going to go home. Obviously, their comrades from the battlefields had gone home, and they were worried about how their families were doing and not being able to support their wives and children back home. And then in early 1919, there was a severe outbreak of the Spanish flu in the camp. And unfortunately, 47 of the German prisoners lost their lives there. There were also some mental health problems at that time because of the difficulties of not knowing how long they would continue to be held. In the summer of 1919, they decided to take matters into their own hands. So they wrote repeatedly to the Swiss legation. They wrote to the War Office pleading to be sent home and asking for information. The German prisoners also tried to win the sympathy of the British public. And I'll read an extract from their book now so you can see how they went about doing that. Traditional diamond-shaped paper kites and box kites floated high in the sun-drenched air or sailed across the blue sky. And these kites would have had messages on them saying, "Please send us home," or "Prisoners of peace," or such slogans. So one of our pilots spent weeks secretly building a 2-metre-long aeroplane, which unfortunately crashed during takeoff and smashed to pieces due to poor weather conditions. Again, the aeroplane probably contained leaflets that they were intending to get out of the camp. But that was just the beginning. On the 5th of August at 3 p.m, a communal "ah" was heard throughout the camp. The prisoners rushed out of their barracks, craning their heads to gaze in wonder at the sky. A bell-shaped red balloon, 2 metres tall, rose from inside the camp amid the smoke of the burning gas that fueled it and floated merrily towards Skipton. The guards watched in astonishment, uncertain whether to shoot at this German messenger as it rose ever higher towards the hills to the southwest. We learnt its fate from the Daily News. The paper reported on the 20th of August 1919. So the newspaper report shows how the German balloon ended up in the back garden of a house in Sheffield, and it was full of leaflets asking that the prisoners be sent home. So many people in Skipton had no idea that almost 1,000 German officers and men had spent almost 2 years on the north edge of this town in North Yorkshire. And this story shows, along with the certificates from Georg Brücke, how this small Yorkshire town was connected to a global war.